Before the ink dried on those papers, Silas Vane smiled. Not the polite smile of a neighbor. The slow, satisfied smile of a man who had already won and wanted her to know it. He turned to Mara, standing in the doorway of her family's kitchen, flowers still on her hands, and said, "A woman like you has no business holding land she can't pay for." Then he folded the foreclosure notice, tucked it into his coat, and walked out past her without a second glance. Mara didn't move, didn't speak. Because there are moments in a person's life when the ground beneath them shifts so completely that the body simply refuses to believe it. Her mother was buried 20 yards from that kitchen door. If you had been standing in her shoes that morning, what would you have done? If stories like this one speak to something deep inside you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels, because the best part? It's only just beginning. The road into Iron Hollow Ranch was longer than it looked on a map, if you could even call what Mara Ellsworth was working from a map. It was more of a pencil sketch on the back of an old supply receipt, handed to her by a farrier in Rawlins who'd said, "You sure about that place? Thorne don't hire women for much." She'd thanked him anyway. That had been 2 days ago. Now, walking the last mile in boots that had developed an honest-to-goodness hole in the left sole, Mara could feel every pebble through the leather. The Wyoming summer wasn't gentle about anything. The sun sat flat and ruthless overhead, the kind of heat that didn't shimmer. It just pressed down on you like a hand on the back of your neck. She was 27 years old. She felt 60. The foreclosure had taken everything 3 months back. The house, the outbuildings, 42 acres her father had broken his back to clear, and a kitchen garden her mother had kept going for 19 years through drought and early frost, and every kind of hardship except the kind that comes from a man in a nice coat with paperwork. That kind, it turned out, there was no preparing for. Mara's father had died the winter before the foreclosure. Her younger brother Thomas had gone north looking for railroad work. Her older sister Ruth had married a shopkeeper in Cheyenne and had 2 small children and no room, and had said so in a letter that was very kind and very final. And Mara had stayed on, trying to hold the farm together by sheer stubbornness, paying what she could, negotiating where she couldn't, until the morning Silas Vane himself rode up with his lawyer and his signed documents, and that smile she would not forget as long as she lived. She had walked away from the farm with a carpet bag, a cast-iron skillet, a recipe tin that had belonged to her mother, and 1 silver coin. She'd carried those things to Rawlins. She'd spent most of the money she had on food and a shared sleeping room. She'd looked for work. She'd found nothing that wouldn't require her to hand herself over entirely to someone else's terms in ways she wasn't willing to do. Then she'd heard about Iron Hollow, a big spread, prosperous. A foreman who'd said the cook's position was open. 6 cooks in 18 months. Nobody seemed sure why they kept leaving, and nobody seemed to want to say. That probably should have worried her more than it did. The gate came into view around a bend in the road, and Mara stopped walking. It was a proper gate, heavy timber, iron fittings, the name Iron Hollow, burned into a crosspiece overhead. Beyond it, she could see the shapes of buildings, a water trough, horses in a paddock, the distant figures of men working. She stood there for a moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and took out the coin. It wasn't much. A single silver dollar, worn smooth on one side where she'd rubbed it too many times thinking. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she crouched down, pressed it into the dirt at the side of the road, outside the gate, and stood back up. She didn't fully understand why she did it. She would think about it later and still not be completely sure. Maybe it was because she didn't want to walk in holding her last dollar like a secret she was ashamed of. Maybe it was because she didn't want the weight of it in her pocket while she was trying to stand straight. Maybe it was just something she needed to do to draw a line between what she'd been and what she was going to be now. Whatever the reason, she left it there, and she walked through the gate. The first person she encountered was a ranch hand named Pete, who was maybe 19 years old and had the sunburned, skeptical look of someone who'd been tasked with keeping strangers out, and took it personally. "Help you?" he said, not particularly like he wanted to. "I'm here to see about the cook position," Mara said. "I was told it was open." Pete looked her over. The carpet bag, the boots, the skillet hanging from a strap she'd looped over the bag's handle because there was nowhere else to put it. He didn't say anything for a second. Then he called out over his shoulder, "Dorsey!" and went back to what he'd been doing, which appeared to be repairing a fence post he didn't seem very invested in. The man who came around the corner of the nearest building was probably 45, built like someone had stacked two men on top of each other, with a beard that hadn't been trimmed since approximately the previous administration. He wore his authority the way some men wear boots, like he'd been born in them and would die in them, and didn't particularly care what you thought about that. "Caleb Dorsey," he said, not offering a hand. "I run the hands here." "Mara Ellsworth," she said. "I'm looking for the ranch owner. I heard you might be needing a cook." Dorsey looked at the skillet. Something moved in his expression that wasn't quite a smile. "That's so," he said. "That's so." He seemed to be considering something. Then he turned his head and called toward a larger building set apart from the bunkhouse. What she'd later understand was the main house. "Someone go find Mr. Thorne. Tell him there's a woman at the gate looking for the cook job." He said woman the way someone else might have said apparition. Mara didn't react. She'd been spoken to in that tone before. She'd learned that reacting to it was a waste of energy she needed for other things. She waited for 11 minutes. She counted, because counting kept her focused and standing there in the sun with Dorsey watching her from 10 feet away and three other hands who drifted over to watch from a respectful distance. Respectful in the sense of far enough to pretend they weren't watching was not a comfortable situation, and comfort had never come from letting her mind go still in uncomfortable moments. 11 minutes after the message was sent, Gideon Thorne came out of the main house. It wasn't what she'd expected. She hadn't let herself expect too much, but whatever shape she'd given him in her mind, it wasn't this exactly. He was tall, lean, not in the wiry way of men who forgot to eat, but in the way of men who worked and didn't stop working for any reason, including eating. His hair was dark with some gray in it. He was 39, though she'd learned that only later. He walked like someone who'd made a decision to be somewhere and didn't see the point in taking longer to get there than necessary. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "my name is Mara Ellsworth. I've come about the cook position." Gideon Thorne had a face that was difficult to read, not because it was cold, exactly, but because it seemed like a face that had gotten accustomed to processing things internally rather than displaying them. He looked at her the same way he probably looked at everything, carefully, without much to indicate what he was thinking. "Where have you cooked before?" he said. "My family's farm, outside Rollins," she said. 18 years. 3 field hands, 2 family members, myself. Harvest season, we fed up to 11. That's a farm kitchen. It is. This is 43 men on a working cattle ranch. I can see it's a bigger operation, she said. I'd be willing to start smaller if that's what you need to feel comfortable, but I'd rather you just show me your kitchen. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile, more like a small recalibration. You don't want to talk about your experience? Mr. Thorne, she said, and she said it evenly. I've been walking since before sunrise. I can tell you I'm experienced, or I can show you I'm experienced. One of those actually proves something. Dorsey made a sound that might have been a laugh. If a laugh could be suppressed so thoroughly, it only came out as a brief exhale through the nose. Gideon looked at Dorsey. Dorsey straightened his face. Gideon looked back at Mara. Come on then, he said. Boy, she'd expected bad. She hadn't expected the particular kind of bad the Iron Hollow kitchen turned out to be. It wasn't dirty in the way of neglect exactly. Someone had been keeping the worst of it at bay. But the storage was a disaster. Sacks of flour pushed against a wall where they were picking up moisture, dried goods mixed in without any system of rotation so that older supplies sat buried under newer ones and would rot before anyone reached them. There were 3 full sacks of beans that had already started to turn, a barrel of salt pork that had been opened and improperly resealed, and the shelf organization, if you could call it that, appeared to have been designed by someone whose primary organizational principle was, whatever I was holding, I put it down. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned slowly, looking at all of it. Gideon stood in the doorway watching her. How much food have you lost in the last month? She asked, without looking at him. A pause. I don't track the kitchen personally. Then let me tell you what I'm seeing. She walked to the far wall and opened a sack. The smell hit before she even got the top fully folded back. You've lost these beans already. This is probably $3 of food. She moved to the salt pork barrel, pressed the lid, showed him where the seal had failed. This is going to turn if it hasn't already. That's another $2–3 depending on weight. She turned to the flour sacks. These need to be elevated, and they need to be against a dry wall. In this heat, pushed against that stone, you're going to lose at least one of these before the month is out. She stopped. She looked at him directly. I'd guess you're losing somewhere between $8 and $12 of provisions a month to poor storage alone, she said. That's before spoilage during preparation, before waste from irregular meal timing, before whatever you're spending to keep men who aren't being fed properly from leaving. I don't know what you've been paying your cooks, but I'd be willing to bet I save you more than my wages in the first month just from fixing this room. The silence stretched. Gideon Thorne looked at the flour sacks, looked at the bean sacks, looked back at her. You learned all that from an 18-year-old family kitchen, he said. His voice was flat, not dismissive, testing. I learned all that from watching my family lose a farm, Mara said. And she hadn't meant to say it that way exactly. It came out harder than she'd intended, but she didn't take it back. He gave her the week. He said it simply, without much ceremony. You've got until Friday. Show me what you said you could show me. That's only 5 days. I know what day it is. And if I don't meet whatever standard you've set in your head, he looked at her steadily. You leave. No hard feelings. Mara nodded once. And if I do? He seemed to consider this as if it were a question he hadn't actually prepared for. Then we talk about a real arrangement, he said. She put out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and businesslike, which she respected. She'd met men who shook a woman's hand like they were picking up something fragile, and she'd never liked it. I'll need access to the accounts, she said. Just the food budget. I want to see what's been spent. That's... He stopped. Started again. Why? Because I need to know if the problem is money or if it's management, she said. And if it's management, I want to fix it properly. He studied her for a long moment. Then he went to his desk, pulled out a ledger, and set it on the kitchen table without a word. She worked through the night, not because she had to, because she needed to understand what she was working with before she cooked a single thing. She went through the ledger line by line, and what she found was not a story of poverty. Iron Hollow had money. The provisions budget was more than adequate. The problem was entirely in execution. Supplies ordered without regard for what was already in stock. No system for what came in first going out first. Meals served on a schedule that had nothing to do with when the hands actually came in from work, which meant food sat, or men ate cold, or men skipped eating entirely and worked hungry, which led to worse work, which led to shorter tempers, which probably explained at least some of why 6 cooks had found the job intolerable. She made notes. Around 2 in the morning, Gideon appeared in the doorway of the kitchen in his shirt sleeves, holding a lamp. He stopped when he saw her still at the table. You don't sleep? He said. I sleep, she said. Not yet. He looked at the ledger open in front of her, the pages of her own notes alongside it. Find anything useful? He said. He didn't sound annoyed. He sounded genuinely curious, which surprised her. Your last cook was ordering salt at the same price you could get it in bulk for half, she said. Over a year, that's probably... She did the arithmetic in her head. $40. Maybe more. He was quiet. Nobody caught that? She said. Nobody was looking, he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with that careful internal face of his, and for just a second she thought she saw something else under it. Not embarrassment exactly, something more like the feeling of a man who has let a thing go on too long and is only now realizing how long. I'll fix it, she said. He nodded once and went back to wherever he'd come from. She went back to the ledger. The first meal she cooked was the following evening. A beef and root stew. Nothing complicated, the kind of thing she could make with what was available while she was still getting the kitchen reorganized. She'd found the beef in decent shape. The root vegetables needed sorting. She'd pulled the best of them. She'd seasoned it the way her mother had taught her, slowly, tasting at every stage, adjusting. And she'd baked bread alongside because she'd seen the state of what was passing for bread currently, and it had offended her personally. The hands came in for supper tired and skeptical. Dorsey sat at the end of the table nearest the door, which she suspected was deliberate, so he could leave easily if the food wasn't worth staying for. She set the stew down. She put the bread on the table. She went back to the kitchen and didn't watch. She heard the silence change. It was something she'd learned to listen for over years of feeding people. There was the silence of people who were eating out of obligation, which had a certain restless performative quality. Silverware hitting bowls more than necessary. The sound of people being polite. And then there was the silence of people who'd stopped thinking about anything except what was in front of them, which was a different thing entirely. The second kind of silence settled over that dining room like something heavy and warm being lowered onto the table. After a while, Dorsey said, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, "Well." Nobody answered him. They were all eating. Gideon ate at his own table in the smaller room off the main hall. She'd sent a portion there without asking whether he wanted it. She figured if he didn't, he'd say so. She was cleaning up when she heard footsteps, and he appeared at the kitchen doorway again. He didn't say anything immediately. She looked up from the pot she was scrubbing. "My mother made something like this," he said. "When I was young." She waited. "She's been gone 11 years, he said. He said it the way people say things they don't say very often, flatly, almost without inflection, like the words had been stored somewhere they weren't accessed much, and the retrieval mechanism was a little rusty. "I'm sorry," Mara said. He nodded. He looked around the kitchen, at the reorganized shelves, the labeled containers, the things she'd already fixed just in the hours since he'd agreed to give her the week. "It doesn't look like the same room," he said. "It isn't," she said. "Not yet. But it'll get there." He seemed like he was going to say something else. Then he didn't. He just nodded again and walked away. Mara stood in the kitchen for a moment after he left. She looked at the shelves she'd organized. She thought about her mother's kitchen, which had smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke and the particular sweetness of apples cooking down in late autumn. She thought about Silas Vane's smile. She picked up the next pot and kept working. The days that followed were not easy. She hadn't expected them to be. Dorsey was her primary obstacle, and he was good at it. Not openly hostile, she'd been braced for that, knew how to handle open hostility. Dorsey was subtler. He was the kind of man who expressed doubt through bureaucratic inconvenience, supply requests that got delayed, information about mealtimes that somehow didn't get communicated back to her, a general atmosphere around her of "we're watching and waiting for you to fail," that he cultivated without quite saying anything specific enough to confront. She didn't confront him. She documented everything, fixed what she could fix around the obstacles, and waited for the moment. He'd either push hard enough to require a direct response or realize she wasn't leaving and adjust. On the third day, a young hand named Bobby, maybe 17, thin in the way of someone who'd been thin for a while, came into the kitchen an hour after supper, looking like he'd been rehearsing how to ask for something and still hadn't worked out the right way to say it. "Kitchen's closed," Mara said, without looking up from her inventory sheet. "Yes, ma'am," Bobby said. He didn't leave. She looked up. He was standing there with his hat in his hands and the expression of someone who hadn't eaten enough at supper because there were older men at the table and the older men ate first. She set down her pen. "Sit down," she said. "I don't want to be trouble. I said sit down." He sat. She fixed him a plate. Not the stew, that was gone, but bread and cold meat and what was left of the potato side, and she set it in front of him and stood at the counter while he ate, not watching him in a way that would embarrass him, just being present in case he needed anything else. When he was done, he said quietly, "Thank you, ma'am." "What's your name?" she asked. "Bobby Crane." "Bobby," she said. "Starting tomorrow. I'm changing the meal schedule. Supper will have a second serving window an hour after the first. Anyone who misses the first comes to the second window. There's always enough." He looked at her. Something passed through his expression that was too complicated to name easily. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He put on his hat and went out. Mara stood alone in the kitchen and thought that some things were simple to fix once you decided that fixing them was what mattered, and that the hardest part was usually just deciding. By the end of that first week, Mara hadn't just kept the kitchen running. She'd made it unrecognizable. Not in a dramatic way. She hadn't repainted walls or bought new equipment or done anything that cost money she didn't have authorization to spend. She'd simply imposed order on a space that had been operating on chaos for so long that the chaos had started to look like the natural state of things. The flour sacks were elevated and against the dry interior wall. The storage rotation system she'd written out on a piece of brown paper and nailed above the pantry door was already being followed, mostly because she'd explained to the two youngest hands who helped with kitchen chores exactly why it mattered, and they'd understood and taken a kind of ownership over it that she hadn't expected but was grateful for. The beans that had already turned were gone. The salt pork barrel had been properly resealed. The meal schedule had been revised so that supper ran in two windows, and the second window meant that Bobby Crane and the three other hands who'd been quietly going without were no longer quietly going without. None of that was the most important thing that happened that week. The most important thing was something Mara didn't fully register until Friday morning, when Gideon called her into the main room to give his answer about whether she was staying. She walked in expecting the same careful, assessing expression he'd worn all week. What she found instead was a man sitting at his desk with her notes spread out in front of him, the pages she'd filled the first night going through the ledger, the inventory sheets, the cost projections she'd worked out for the supply changes she was recommending. He'd clearly been through all of it. There were marks on the pages in a different hand. He looked up when she came in. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "You estimated $8 to $12 a month in storage losses," he said. "I went back through the last 6 months of accounts. It's closer to 15. "I didn't have the full picture that first night," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you were right about the direction of it." He set down the pages. "The salt, the meal timing, the second serving window. The hands are working better when they've eaten properly," she said. "That's not complicated." "I know it's not complicated." He said it without irritation, but with something underneath it, something that sounded like a man who was being honest with himself about having let something obvious go unaddressed for too long. "I should have caught it." She could have agreed with him. She chose not to. "You were watching the land and the cattle," she said. "Someone else should have been watching the kitchen." He looked at her. "That someone is you," he said. "If you want it." It wasn't quite the formal offer she'd expected. It wasn't followed by a number or terms. It just sat there between them. "I want to know what happened to the other 6, she said. He was quiet for a moment. 3 left because the work was harder than they'd expected, he said. 1 left because Dorsey made his opinion of her cooking known in a way that crossed a line I should have addressed sooner. He paused. I addressed it after the fact, which was too late. And the other 2? 1 had family trouble and needed to go home, he said. The last one, he stopped. She found the accounts and started skimming. Not much, but enough. Mara nodded. And so you're careful about who has access to the accounts. I was, he said, until I handed you the ledger 2 hours after you arrived. She hadn't thought about it that way. She looked at him. Why did you do that? He seemed genuinely uncertain of the answer. You asked for it like it was the obvious next step, he said, and you were right that it was. There was a pause that wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but had weight to it. I want $30 a month, Mara said, and full authority over the kitchen, purchasing, scheduling, staffing. I'll report the accounts to you monthly. You can audit anything you want, anytime you want. He didn't flinch at the number. She'd been prepared for negotiation. Done, he said. She hadn't been prepared for that. She kept her expression level. All right then. One thing, he said. She waited. Dorsey. He said the name the way you'd set a complicated object on the table to look at. He's been here 8 years. He runs the hands well. He also has opinions about how this ranch should operate that don't always align with mine, and he's not used to being overruled. I know, she said. He's going to push back on some of what you're changing. He already has. Gideon looked at her steadily. Can you handle him? She thought about it honestly. I don't know yet, she said, but I'm not going to fight him for the sake of it. If he's right about something, I'll say so. If he's wrong, I'll say that too, and I won't back down. He nodded once, picked up his pen. Then we have a deal, Miss Ellsworth. She stood, started toward the door. Mara, he said. She turned. The stew, he said. He stopped like he'd started to say something and then reconsidered what he actually wanted to say. You made it the way my mother used to. Not the same, but close. She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He'd already looked back down at his desk. I'll make it again sometime, she said, and she went back to her kitchen. The weeks that followed were a different kind of hard from the first week. The first week had been about proving herself to Gideon, which turned out to be straightforward because Gideon was a man who watched and weighed evidence and revised his position when the evidence warranted. The weeks after were about proving herself to everyone else, which was more complicated because everyone else was not operating entirely on evidence. Dorsey was the center of it, but not in the ways she'd anticipated. He didn't openly challenge her again the way he had in the first few days. What he did instead was subtler and in some ways more exhausting, a constant low-level resistance that expressed itself in small things. Supplies she'd ordered that arrived late because the order had sat on his desk before being passed along. Schedule information that reached her kitchen incomplete. Opinions about her methods delivered in the third person, in her hearing, to other hands. Some people think feeding cowboys like they're dining at a hotel is going to make them soft, he'd say, loud enough to carry, to nobody in particular. She ignored it when she could and addressed it when she couldn't. The day she couldn't was a Tuesday, 3 weeks into her tenure, when she came out of the root cellar to find that the new supply of beef she'd been expecting had been delivered and put away by Dorsey without her, in exactly the arrangement she'd specifically asked not to use, which would make it impossible to rotate properly. She stood in the storage room looking at it for a moment. Then she walked out to the yard where Dorsey was supervising the repair of a fence section and waited until he looked up. "Mr. Dorsey," she said, "the beef." "Got put away," he said. "Not the way I asked." "It'll be ready on time," she said. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the counter for a full 2 minutes before she started cooking, because her hands were shaking slightly, and she needed them to stop. She had been at Iron Hollow for 6 weeks when Silas Vane came for the first time. She didn't know who he was immediately. She saw the arrival from the kitchen window. A man on a good horse, too well dressed for a working visit, with 2 riders behind him who had the look of men paid to stand nearby in case standing nearby was needed. She watched Gideon come out of the main house to greet the visitor, saw them shake hands with the ease of men who knew each other, and went back to what she was doing. She learned the name at supper that evening, when the hands who'd been within hearing range of the meeting let pieces of it drop in conversation the way they always did. Not gossiping exactly, just information traveling the way it did in close quarters. "Vane's back," Pete said to Dorsey across the table. Dorsey grunted. "What does he want this time?" Earl asked. "Same as always, probably. After the eastern pasture." Mara set down a pot and didn't say anything, but she listened. "Mr. Thorne's not selling," Dorsey said. "Told him same as last year and the year before." "Man like Vane doesn't take no for an answer 3 times and give up," Pete said. Dorsey looked up. "No," he said. "He doesn't." Something in the way he said it made Mara look at him. He caught her looking and something shifted in his expression. Not hostility for once, but something more like reluctant information being conveyed. "He's a persistent man," Dorsey said, addressing the table generally. "And he's got money enough to be patient about it." That was all. But Mara thought about it long after supper. She had a reason to think about it more carefully the following week, when Gideon mentioned, in passing, that Vane had made a formal offer for the eastern pasture. "Are you considering it?" she asked. She was reorganizing the spice shelf and didn't stop doing it while she spoke, because she'd found that people sometimes said more when you weren't looking directly at them. "The price is good," Gideon said. "What's on the eastern pasture?" "Grass, mostly. Some timber at the far edge." "And the creek?" A pause. "The creek runs through it," he said. She set down the jar she was holding and turned around. "The creek that feeds your cattle water in the dry months?" "The property has 2 water sources." "Mr. Thorne," she said, and she said it carefully because she'd learned to be careful with him when she thought he was about to make a mistake. "The north well has been running low since late July. I've been managing the kitchen water carefully because of it. Your second water source is a well, and it's been struggling in the heat. The creek is your reliable water. It feeds the eastern pasture, and the eastern pasture borders the grazing land where your best cattle run in dry season." He was listening. She could tell because his expression had gone still in the particular way it did when he was processing something rather than preparing a response. "Silas Vane is not a man who's after your grass," she said. "If he buys the eastern pasture, he controls access to that creek. And if he controls that creek in a dry summer—" She stopped. She'd seen it happen before. Not with a creek, but with a debt. With paperwork that seemed straightforward until it wasn't. With a man who smiled and shook hands and had already planned 3 moves ahead. She knew what it looked like. This is how my family lost the farm, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. Not all at once. First, we sold a smaller field to cover a debt. The man who bought it was friendly about it, very reasonable. Turned out the field sat between our main water access and the road. Took him 18 months to make that matter. Gideon was very still. I'm not telling you what to do, she said. It's your land. But I'd want to know a great deal more about what Vane intends to do with that pasture before I'd consider the price worth it. He stood there for a moment. I haven't said yes, he said. I know. I haven't said no either. I know that too, she said. I'm just telling you what I see. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. He stood there with it in his hand, looking at the floor, not putting it on. He's coming back next Thursday for an answer, he said. Then you have until Thursday to figure out what the right answer is, she said. He put on his hat and walked out. Thursday came. Mara was in the kitchen when Vane arrived, but she positioned herself near the side window that looked onto the main yard because she wanted to see him clearly. He was in his late 50s, she estimated, well preserved in the way of men whose money insulated them from most forms of weather and labor. His face was pleasant. That was the word for it. A pleasant face. The kind of face that had probably been useful to him his entire life precisely because pleasantness invited trust and trust invited in caution. She watched him shake Gideon's hand. She watched his two riders stay behind. She watched them go inside. She went back to her bread. 40 minutes later, she heard Vane's voice in the corridor. Not the words, just the sound of it. The easy, unhurried cadence of a man who was satisfied with a conversation. Then the door. Then horses. Gideon came into the kitchen 20 minutes after that. He's gone, he said. Did you tell him no? A pause. I told him I needed more time. She shaped a loaf and didn't look up. Did he accept that? He smiled and said he was a patient man, Gideon said. She did look up then. I know, Gideon said before she could say anything. I know. She didn't find out about the rumors until they were already established. That was the nature of rumors. By the time you heard them, they had already put down roots and people were already treating them as background information, the kind of thing everyone knew. The specific form this particular set of rumors took was that Mara Ellsworth had arrived at Iron Hollow without references or history, had inserted herself into Gideon Thorne's confidence through what was delicately described as feminine manipulation, and was building up influence over the ranch's affairs in ways that went well beyond cooking. She heard the first version of this from the woman at the dry goods counter in Harlow's store in town, who went quiet in a particular way when Mara came in to place a supply order. Not rude, just careful. Measured. Mara placed the order, asked on her way out if everything was all right. Fine, the woman said. Too quickly. She heard this more specific version a week later from Bobby Crane, who told her with the frank awkwardness of someone who felt she deserved to know. They're saying in town that you talk Thorne out of business decisions that aren't your business, Bobby said. He was looking at the table while he said it. And that you're doing it for reasons that aren't... He stopped. For your own reasons. And what reasons would those be? She said. Bobby was 17 and had the decency to look genuinely uncomfortable. I don't know. That you're after something. The ranch, maybe. Or just influence. They say you convinced him not to sell to Vane because you want him dependent on you. Mara was quiet for a moment. Who says this? She asked. Not angrily, just directly. It's around, Bobby said. In town, at the hardware store, at the feed store. Mrs. Harlow was talking about it to Mrs. Pierce when I was in last week. Mrs. Harlow was talking about it, she repeated. She's the one who organized the thing. Bobby stopped. What thing? He looked genuinely pained. There's a letter, going to Mr. Thorne, from some of the prominent folks in town, asking him to reconsider your position here. She sat with that for a moment. All right, she said. Thank you for telling me, Bobby. He looked up. What are you going to do? I'm going to make dinner, she said, and then I'm going to think about it. She made dinner. Then she thought about it. What she came to, after a long time sitting alone in the kitchen after the dishes were done, was something she'd learned years ago watching her father try to fight the rumors that spread before the foreclosure. The whispers about his poor management, his failing judgment, his stubborn refusal to adapt. All of it had been designed. All of it had served someone. and her father had spent his energy fighting the rumors directly, trying to correct individual people's impressions, when the thing that needed fighting wasn't the rumors at all. Silas Vane wasn't attacking her reputation because her reputation mattered to him. He was attacking her reputation because she had gotten between him and what he wanted. The distinction was important. Gideon received the letter on a Wednesday. She knew when it arrived because he was different at dinner that evening, quieter than usual in a way that had specific weight to it, the kind of quiet that meant something was sitting on top of it. She didn't ask. She served supper, managed the kitchen, sent the hands out, and waited. He came in around 9. "I need to show you something," he said. He set the letter on the kitchen table. She read it standing up. It was signed by 7 people. She recognized 4 of the names. Mrs. Harlow, whose dry goods store she'd been patronizing. The banker whose name was on the front of the only bank in Larcher Wells, the nearest town of any size. A prominent cattle broker. And a woman named Margaret Fielding, whose name Mara didn't know, but whose title was given as president of the Larcher Wells Ladies Charitable Society, and who had apparently written an entire separate paragraph in a different handwriting at the bottom of the letter, expressing her personal concern for the moral character of Iron Hollow's household. The letter said, in essence, that several of Larcher Wells's most upstanding citizens had become concerned about the influence being exerted over Gideon Thorne by a woman of unknown provenance and uncertain motives, and that they urged him, in the strongest possible terms, to reconsider his staffing arrangement before his good name suffered any further damage. She set the letter down. Gideon was watching her. "What do you want to do?" he asked. The question surprised her. She'd been bracing for a different conversation. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I asked first," he said. She looked at him. He was serious. He was actually asking her. "I want to keep working," she said. "This letter doesn't change anything I'm doing or why I'm doing it." "Then that's what's going to happen," he said. He picked up the letter and set it on the side of the table that wasn't near anything important. "Vane's behind this," she said. "Probably." "Not probably," she said. "The timing is too exact. I gave you a reason to say no to him, and now my character is suddenly questionable." "I know," Gideon said. "Are you going to do about the offer?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking. About whether to sell." "About the creek," he said. "About what you said. I've been thinking about it since you said it, if I'm honest." He ran his hand over the back of his neck. "I rode out to the eastern pasture yesterday, spent some time at the creek." She waited. "My father built this ranch on that water," he said. "In dry years, it's the difference between the herd making it and not." He paused. "I don't know why I ever considered selling it. I think—" He stopped. "I think the money looked good, and I wasn't thinking past the money." It was a hard thing for a man like him to say. She recognized that. "That's human," she said. "It's careless," he said, like he didn't particularly want to be let off the hook for it. She almost smiled. Both can be true. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face shifted. "I'm telling Vane no," he said. "Final answer. This week." "He won't take it well," she said. "I know that too." She nodded. She started putting away the last of the evening things. "Mara," he said. She turned. "The people who signed that letter," he said. "Some of them I've done business with for years." "I know." "If this goes sideways, if Vane makes this difficult for me, some of them will have to pick a side. And they might not pick yours," she said. "Or yours," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Thorne, I walked away from a farm that my family built over 20 years because a man with enough money and enough patience decided he wanted what we had. I didn't fight back then because I didn't have the tools to fight with." She picked up the kettle and hung it back on its hook. "I have more tools now." He was quiet. "Whatever Vane does next," she said, "I'd rather face it here than spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I hadn't walked away from another thing worth keeping." He looked at her for a long moment. "Good night, Miss Ellsworth," he said. "Good night, Mr. Thorne," she said. He left. She stood alone in the kitchen and listened to the sound of the ranch at night. Horses shifting in the paddock, wind moving across the eaves, the particular silence of 43 people asleep in the same place, each one trusting that the next day would be ordered because someone was making sure of it. She banked the kitchen fire, checked the locks, and went to her room. She lay in the dark for a long time. She was thinking about the eastern pasture, about the creek, about a man who smiled pleasantly and had two riders who stayed close by, about a letter with 7 signatures, written so properly, so concerned, so entirely in the service of someone who'd paid them nothing for the favor, but would make it worth their while, eventually, in ways they probably hadn't even fully articulated to themselves. She was thinking about the way Vane had looked when he rode away from the ranch the last time. That easy, unhurried cadence, the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd already won. She was thinking that the coin she'd pressed into the dirt outside the gate still sat there, unrecovered, and that she'd meant something by leaving it even if she hadn't fully known what, and that whatever she'd meant, it still felt true. She turned onto her side. She needed to sleep. Tomorrow there was dinner to plan and accounts to review and a storage inventory that was 2 days overdue, and somewhere out there Silas Vane was thinking about his next move. She intended to be well rested when it came. Gideon sent his refusal to Silas Vane on a Friday morning, carried by one of the hands into Larcher Wells, and delivered in person to Vane's man at the land office. No letter, just a message, spoken plainly. Iron Hollow's eastern pasture was not for sale, not at that price, not at any price, and Mr. Thorne considered the matter closed. By Saturday evening, the matter had reopened itself in a way nobody at Iron Hollow was prepared for. It was Dorsey who brought the news, which was itself unusual enough to make Mara pay attention. Dorsey had spent 2 months performing a careful, deliberate indifference toward her, the kind of indifference that required more effort than actual engagement. So when he appeared in the kitchen doorway on a Saturday evening with his hat in his hand and something in his expression that looked less like his usual guarded authority and more like a man who'd just heard something he hadn't wanted to hear, she set down what she was doing and waited. "There's talk," he said, "from town." "What kind of talk?" He was quiet for a moment, working through something in his head. She had the impression he was deciding how much to say. "The kind that involves your name," he said finally. She looked at him. He came inside, let the door close behind him. That alone told her it was more serious than whatever she'd expected. "There's a woman in Larcher Wells," he said, "Mrs. Adelaide Cross. Runs the boarding house on Clement Street. She's been telling people, a lot of people, over the past 2 days, that she knew a woman named Mara Ellsworth in Rawlins. Claims this woman was let go from her last position under suspicious circumstances. Claims there were questions about her honesty with household accounts." Mara didn't move. "Mrs. Cross?" she said. "Yes." "I have never met a woman named Adelaide Cross," Mara said. "I have never stayed at a boarding house on Clement Street. I have never been let go from any position, because this is the first household position I have held in my life." "I know," Dorsey said. Something about the way he said it, quiet, direct, without his usual reserve, made her look at him more carefully. "How do you know?" she said. "Because I looked into your background myself," he said. 6 weeks ago." She was genuinely surprised. "I have a cousin who works the rail line out of Rawlins," he said. "I asked him to ask around about you and your family." He paused. "Your father was Eli Ellsworth, ran 42 acres north of town for nearly 20 years. Decent man by all accounts. Died in debt through no particular fault of his own and had his land seized in a foreclosure that some people thought was handled wrong. He held his hat by the brim without fidgeting, which told her the conversation was costing him something. "I found nothing to suggest you'd ever stolen from anyone or been asked to leave anything." The kitchen was quiet. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. Dorsey looked at the floor, then up at her. "Because when I looked into you 6 weeks ago, I was looking for a reason to doubt you," he said, "and I didn't find one, and I've spent 6 weeks pretending I didn't know that." He paused. "The least I can do is tell you when someone's lying about you in public." It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but she thought it might be the closest thing to one that a man like Caleb Dorsey knew how to produce. "Thank you," she said. "Does Mr. Thorne know?" "I was going to tell him next," Dorsey said. "Tell him," she said. "Tonight." He nodded once and went. Gideon's response to the news was to be very quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. His usual quiet was processing. This quiet was something else. She saw it the next morning at breakfast when he came in for coffee. His face had that closed, set quality of someone who'd been awake longer than they should have been, working through something that hadn't resolved. "Dorsey told you," she said. Not a question. He told me, Gideon said. She poured the coffee. He wrapped both hands around the mug and stood at the counter instead of sitting, which he sometimes did when he didn't want to have a conversation at a table because sitting at a table made a conversation more formal than he wanted. I know a man in Rawlins, he said, attorney named Greenwald. I sent him a wire this morning asking him to look into whether there's any Adelaide Cross connecting establishment on Clement Street in Larcher Wells or anywhere else. You think she doesn't exist, Mara said. I think the timing is… He stopped. It's been 4 days since I sent Vane my refusal. 4 days exactly. Yes, she said. He works fast. He's been working on this for a while, she said. He just didn't need it until now. When you were still considering his offer, he had no reason to use it. Now he does. Gideon drank his coffee, set the mug down, picked it up again. I want to go into town, he said. I want to talk to some people directly. That might make it worse, she said, right? Staying here and saying nothing is making it worse, he said, and he wasn't wrong, so she didn't argue. What are you going to say? That I employ Mara Ellsworth, and I stand behind her character, and anyone who says otherwise is either misinformed or lying. She looked at him. And when they ask why you're so certain, he looked back at her. Something in his expression was more direct than it usually was. Because I've watched you, he said. Every day for 2 months I've watched you. How you work, how you treat the people who work with you, how you think about problems, how you tell me when I'm about to make a mistake. He paused. I know what a person looks like when they're building something, and I know what they look like when they're running a con, and those are not the same. She was quiet. Mr. Thorne, she started. Gideon, he said. It came out slightly unexpected, like he'd thought about it, and then said it slightly before he'd fully decided to. I think we've been working together long enough. She looked at him. Gideon, she said. Trying it out? He nodded. Picked up his hat. I'll be back by supper, he said. She watched him go and stood in the kitchen alone and felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with the kitchen and everything to do with the fact that she'd spent so long not letting herself think about anything beyond what needed doing next that she'd almost missed the thing that was already happening. She pushed it aside. There was inventory to do. He came back before supper looking like the trip into town had gone. The way difficult trips into town usually went, which is to say, not badly enough to be definitive and not well enough to feel resolved. Mrs. Cross exists, he said, coming into the kitchen and dropping into a chair in the way he did when he was tired and didn't have the energy to maintain his usual postural dignity. She runs a boarding house. It's on Prospect Street, not Clement, but it's in Larcher Wells. She's real. And she's telling people she knew me in Rawlins. To anyone who'll listen. He rubbed his face with both hands. I talked to Greenwald's man. He's got a local contact who knows the legal picture here. The problem is there's nothing to legally disprove yet. It's gossip. There's no court, no formal accusation, nothing that can be answered in an official way. It's just… He gestured. A story, Mara said. Repeated enough times that it becomes the thing people assume when they hear my name. Yes. It doesn't have to be true, she said. It just has to be everywhere before the truth is. He looked at her. I told Harlow you were a person of good character and that I'd stake my reputation on it. What did she say? She said she was sure I believed that. His mouth compressed. Which is a very specific kind of insult delivered in a very polite way. Mara nodded slowly. She'd encountered that particular weapon before. The expression of trust in someone's sincerity rather than in the facts they were presenting. It left no room to argue without seeming defensive. The banker? She asked. Polite, non-committal. He mentioned that community confidence was important in business relationships, and he hoped everything would become clear in time. Gideon's voice had gone flat reciting it. Which means he's waiting to see which way this goes, she said. Which means he's waiting to see which way this goes, he confirmed. She sat down across from him. The kitchen was empty. The hands had already eaten and gone. The kitchen boy had been sent home. It was just the two of them at the kitchen table with the lamp between them and the sound of the evening wind outside. What did you find out about Mrs. Cross herself? She said. Something shifted in his expression. That's the interesting part, he said. She's been in Larcher Wells about 4 months. Before that, she was in Casper. Before Casper, nobody's quite sure. She arrived in town with enough money to rent the boarding house and start taking guests, and she has a comfortable relationship with several of the more prominent merchants. Including the ones who signed the letter, Mara said. Including 2 of them. They sat with that. Vane placed her, Mara said. I can't prove it. You don't need to prove it tonight, she said. But that's what happened. She's not a witness he found. She's a witness he installed. Probably 6 months ago, 8 months. Long enough to become a known person in the community before he needed her. Gideon was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. You think like that, he said. You think ahead like that. I grew up watching someone who didn't, she said, and I watched what it cost him. He was quiet for a moment. What do we do? It was the first time he'd said we about something other than the ranch's practical operations. She noticed it without remarking on it. We need to know what Vane actually has, she said. Right now we're responding to shadows. The letter, the rumors, Mrs. Cross. Those are all interference. They're designed to keep us occupied with defending my reputation while something else is happening that actually matters. Such as what? I don't know yet, she said. But Vane isn't doing all of this just to make your life unpleasant. He wants the eastern pasture. He's wanted it for years. The rumor campaign is the pressure he's applying to make you reconsider, but there will be something else underneath it, something more concrete. She tapped her finger on the table, thinking. When was the last time you checked your property documents? She said. Your deed, the original survey maps, the boundary records? He looked at her. I keep them in my study, he said. I haven't... He stopped. I looked at them 2 years ago when there was a question about the north fence line. When was Vane last inside this house? She watched the answer register on his face, watched the moment when the question landed and the implications of it spread outward like a stone dropped in still water. Because Silas Vane had been inside the main house. 3 weeks ago, when he'd come to discuss the offer. Gideon had met with him in the front room, which was adjacent to the study. She'd watched them from the kitchen window. They'd been inside for 40 minutes, and Gideon had been in and out. She'd seen him step outside briefly, come back, which meant Vane had been alone in that part of the house for at least some portion of those 40 minutes. The silence between them stretched long enough to become its own answer. My study, Gideon said. He was already standing. The documents were kept in a leather portfolio in the bottom drawer of Gideon's desk. The original deed, the survey maps, copies of water rights registrations, boundary confirmations. She stood in the doorway of the study and watched him go through them, item by item, setting each one on the desk surface with the methodical care of a man who was very much hoping to find everything in order. He didn't find everything in order. This isn't right, he said. His voice was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. This was the voice of someone looking at something they couldn't quite make themselves accept. She crossed the room and looked at what he was holding. It was the boundary survey. She'd never seen it before, but she could read the general shape of it. The lines indicating property extent, the notations at the edges, the coordinates and measurements. She could also see along the eastern boundary line a section that had clearly been added at a different time from the rest. The ink was slightly different in quality, not dramatically, but enough. And the notation in the margin was in a hand that didn't quite match the other handwritten elements on the page. What does that notation say? She asked. He read it to her. His voice was very steady, which she thought cost him something. The notation, in the different hand, indicated an amendment to the original boundary survey. It stated that the eastern boundary of Iron Hollow property ended at a point 40 yards west of the creek bed, rather than at the creek bed itself as the rest of the document described. If the notation was legitimate, the creek didn't belong to Iron Hollow. If the notation was legitimate, Silas Vane didn't need to buy the eastern pasture. He just needed to ride up and claim the water. This was added, Gideon said. Not a question. Yes, Mara said. When I had the fence line dispute 2 years ago, I looked at this document, he said. He was still looking at it like he was trying to find a different interpretation. This notation wasn't here. I know. So between 2 years ago and now, between 3 weeks ago and now, she said. Or it was done off-site and put back in place of the original. Either way, Vane's had access to either this document or to someone who could replicate it closely enough. Gideon set the document down on the desk. He put both hands flat on either side of it and stood there looking at it. She had seen men reach the edge of what they could hold composure over. She'd watched her father do it the morning the foreclosure notice arrived. The way the surface of someone held, and then something in the eyes shifted, something in the jaw changed, and you could see the exact moment when the magnitude of what was happening stopped being a problem to solve and became a loss to absorb. She was watching it happen to Gideon Thorne right now. 40 yards, he said. On paper, right now I don't own my own water. On paper, she said. On paper that was tampered with. That's different from fact. In a legal proceeding, it might not be different enough. That's why we don't let it get to a legal proceeding on Vane's terms, she said. We take this to the county records office before he does. We establish that this amendment is fraudulent before he files anything based on it. He looked up at her. The original survey, she said, before this amendment. Do you have anything that predates it? Your father's documents, his original purchase records, anything that would show the boundary as it was before this notation appeared? He thought. The cellar, he said. My father kept everything. He didn't throw things away. There are boxes down there I haven't opened in 10 years. Then that's where we start, she said. The cellar under the main house was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd built something from the ground up and kept a record of every step of the building, organized in the sense that things were in boxes, and the boxes were labeled, disorganized in the sense that the labels were in a personal shorthand that required knowing the man who'd written them to decode. Gideon knew most of it. Some of it he stood over for a long moment before he remembered what it meant, which told her how long it had been since he'd been down here. There was something about watching him move through his father's stored life, picking up boxes, opening them, setting aside the ones that weren't what they needed, that felt private in a way she tried to respect. She took one side of the cellar, and he took the other, and they worked in near silence, and she thought about how much of a person's history ended up in boxes in places like this. How much of what people built and kept and cared about became something their children sorted through when the time came, half remembered and half foreign. She found the first relevant item 40 minutes into the search, a packet of papers tied with a cord and labeled in an older hand, property. Original. 1871. She brought it to Gideon. He untied it. They spread the documents on top of a crate and read them together by lamplight, standing close enough that she could feel the slight warmth of him, and was aware of it in a way that was inconvenient at the moment, and which she set aside for exactly that reason. The original survey was there, dated 1871, signed by 2 surveyors, witnessed by the county registrar. The boundary line ran clearly to the creek bed. There was no amendment, no notation, no 40-yard deviation from anything. Jonas Mercer, Gideon said, reading the surveyor's name from the bottom of the document. Mara's eyes went to the same name. Something clicked. She'd seen this name before. She was certain of it, with the kind of certainty that's more physical than intellectual. A recognition in the body before the mind has caught up. She turned back through the packet, looking for the thing she'd seen it in. There was a secondary document, a letter, actually, confirming the completion of the survey, and at the bottom of it was a note in a different hand indicating that a copy of the survey had been filed with the county land office. Filed, meaning there was a second copy, filed with the county, which meant Vane would have needed to access county records, not just this house, to alter both documents consistently. Has the county record been checked? She asked. Gideon looked at her. I don't know. We need to check it before Vane does, she said. Because if his amendment only appears in the document here, the county record contradicts it. But if he's been to the county office too, then both records say the same wrong thing, Gideon said, and we're left with only what we find in this cellar. She looked at the original survey, at the name at the bottom. Jonas Mercer, she said again. He was an old man when he surveyed this property in 71, Gideon said. He'd be 80, maybe. More. I don't know if he's still alive. Do you know where he was from? Gideon thought. Somewhere south, Carbon County maybe. My father mentioned him a few times, said he was the most reliable man with a survey instrument in the territory. If he's alive and we can find him, Mara said, and if his memory holds, he's the only person who can testify to what this boundary actually looked like, independent of both the house document and the county record. She was looking at the survey. Her mind was moving fast, and she was trying to keep up with it. We need 3 things, she said. We need to get to the county land office in Harlow County. Is that where the original filing would be? Yes. We need to get there before Vane makes any formal filing based on his amended document, and we need to photograph or copy what we find there, because if the record has already been changed, we need to document that change for the attorney. She paused. And we need to find Jonas Mercer. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You figured all of this out in 20 minutes in my cellar, he said. I figured out the shape of it, she said. The details are going to be harder. He looked at her in the lamplight. His face was still carrying what she'd seen in the study, the weight of what this meant, the magnitude of the threat to the thing his father had built, and he'd spent his life maintaining. But something else had come into it now, a resolve that looked like it had been there all along, waiting to be reached. Everett Shaw, he said. He's the best attorney in 2 counties. I'll send for him first thing tomorrow, and I'll send 2 men to Carbon County to start looking for Mercer. Send men you trust, she said. Pete and... He stopped, reconsidered. Bobby. She thought about Bobby Crane, 17 years old, too thin, loyal in the direct and total way that young people were loyal when someone had treated them with straightforward decency. Yes, she said. Bobby. They stood in the cellar holding the original survey between them, and the lamplight made shadows of everything it didn't reach. And outside the Wyoming night was deep and silent and utterly indifferent to what was happening in this house and what it would mean for the people in it. What's Vane going to do when he realizes we've found this? Gideon said. He'll move faster, she said. He'll try to establish his claim before we can counter it. He'll make noise in town, get the people he already has in his pocket to amplify the story, try to make your attorney's involvement look like you're the one being aggressive. She paused. He'll probably also try to approach you privately, offer you a way out that looks reasonable and costs you everything. Gideon was looking at her. You know how he thinks, he said. I know how men like him think, she said, because men like him took everything my family had, and I had a long time afterward to understand exactly how. He didn't say anything immediately. Then, I'm sorry that happened. It was simple. He didn't decorate it. She looked at him. So am I, she said. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving. He nodded. She rolled the original survey carefully and put it back in the packet with the cord. We should sleep, she said. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. She carried the lamp toward the cellar steps, and he followed. Well, what she didn't expect was what happened the next morning before Gideon had even sent for Everett Shaw. She was in the kitchen starting breakfast when she heard the sound of a horse arriving, faster than visitors usually arrived. And she looked out the window and saw one of the hands from the Greer property to the south pulling up in the yard. The Greers were neighbors she'd seen only once in passing, an older couple who ran a smaller spread 3 miles south, and their hand arriving at speed before sunrise was not a normal occurrence. Gideon came out of the house in his shirt sleeves before she'd even taken off her apron. She watched them talk, watched Gideon's face go through something she couldn't fully read from the window, watched the hand gesture toward the south, toward town, in a way that indicated whatever he was telling was larger than just the Greer property. She put down the pan and went outside. Gideon turned when he heard her. The county land office was broken into last night, he said. The Greer hand was coming to tell me because... He stopped. Because whoever went in there went through the records section. The registrar arrived this morning to find the deed files gone through. The morning air was cool and still, and the light was early enough that everything still had that washed, undecided quality it had in the hour before the sun got to work. The county record, she said. We don't know yet what's missing or changed, he said. But Vane knows we found the document, she said. Or he anticipated we would? How would he know? He doesn't need to know, she said. He just needs to be ahead of us. If the county record now matches his amended version of the House document, he doesn't need anything else. He can make a formal filing today, and we're fighting on his timetable with his evidence. Gideon was looking at her with an expression she recognized. Not helplessness, because he wasn't a man prone to helplessness, but the expression of someone who needed to act immediately and was still determining which direction to move in. Pete and Bobby need to leave for Carbon County this morning, she said. Before anything else. The county record may already be compromised. Shaw needs to come today. And you need to secure the original survey from the cellar and get it somewhere Vane can't access. He'd have to come onto my property. He broke into the county land office last night, she said. He's not bound by normal limits. A pause. "You're right," Gideon said. "I know," she said. "Go wake Pete and Bobby. I'll pack them food for the road." He went. She went back to the kitchen and began packing a saddlebag with what would keep: bread, salt meat, dried apples, and her hands were steady while she did it, steadier than they'd been the night before, steadier than she probably had any reason to expect. She kept thinking about Jonas Mercer, an old man, maybe 80, somewhere in Carbon County, who had walked the boundary of this land with surveying instruments in 1871 and drawn a line that was true, who had signed his name to a document that said the creek belonged here. Who might remember? And if he remembered, if Pete and Bobby could find him, if he was alive, if his mind was intact, then Silas Vane's entire construction depended on keeping him silent or keeping him unfound, and those were two very different things from erasing him. She finished packing the saddlebag. She listened to the sounds of the ranch coming awake around her: horses, voices, the specific urgency of men who'd been told something important and were moving accordingly. She thought about the coin she'd pressed into the dirt outside the gate on the day she'd arrived. She thought about all the things she'd carried in instead. She had work to do. Pete and Bobby rode out before the sun was fully up, with the saddlebag Mara had packed and a folded copy she'd made by hand of the key details from the original survey: the surveyor's name, the date, the boundary coordinates, the county where Jonas Mercer had been based in 1871. She'd written it out in the kitchen by lamplight while the ranch was still sleeping, her handwriting small and careful, because paper was limited and she needed everything to fit. She watched them go from the kitchen doorway and then went back inside and started breakfast, because 43 people still needed to eat, regardless of what was happening with property documents and county land offices and men who manipulated records in the dark. Everett Shaw arrived by noon. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 35, with the particular kind of organized energy that good attorneys seem to develop as a professional survival mechanism: the ability to absorb complicated information quickly and start sorting it before you'd finish telling him. He came into Gideon's front room, shook hands, set his case on the table, and listened without interrupting while Gideon laid out the sequence of events from Vane's original offer through the discovery of the amended survey document to the break-in at the county land office the previous night. When Gideon finished, Shaw was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Show me the document." Gideon brought it from the study. He'd moved it the previous night per Mara's suggestion to a locked box in the main bedroom rather than the study desk drawer where Vane had been able to access it. Shaw examined it for several minutes, holding it near the window where the light was better, tilting it at different angles. "The amendment ink is different," he said. "We noticed," Gideon said. "A document examiner could confirm that in a formal proceeding," Shaw said. "This alone is evidence of tampering." He set it down carefully. "What did you find at the county office this morning?" "I went myself after sending the men to Carbon County," Gideon said. "The registrar let me see the file. The county record has the same amendment, same notation, same location on the boundary line." "Same ink difference?" "I couldn't tell. The registrar wouldn't let me handle the document directly." Shaw nodded, unsurprised. "We'll need to petition for a formal examination of both documents by an independent expert. That takes time, and Vane knows it takes time, which is why he moved when he did." He looked up. "Has he filed anything formally yet? Any claim to the water rights or the boundary?" "Not as of this morning," Gideon said, "but I expect that changes soon." "He'll file within the week," Shaw said. "Once he files, we're in a reactive position. We need to get ahead of it." He paused. "The surveyor, Mercer. If he's alive and his testimony is credible, that's the cornerstone. A living witness who performed the original survey and can testify to what the boundary was. That supersedes paperwork, especially paperwork that can be shown to have been altered." Mara had been standing near the doorway during this conversation. Shaw glanced at her for the second time. The first had been when she'd set coffee on the table for the two men, and his glance had been politely neutral. This time it was more direct. "You're the one who found the original survey," he said. "Yes." "And identified the ink difference." "It wasn't difficult," she said. "The amendment was done carefully, but not carefully enough." He studied her for a moment. "Gideon tells me you also identified Vane's strategy with the eastern pasture before anyone else did." "I knew what the water access meant," she said. "It wasn't complicated once you looked at the map." Shaw looked at Gideon. "She should be in this conversation," he said. It wasn't a suggestion exactly, more like a man adjusting his model of a situation to fit the evidence in front of him. Gideon looked at Mara. She sat down. The legal strategy Shaw laid out over the next 2 hours was detailed, and Mara thought sound. They would file a preemptive petition with the district court requesting that any claim to Iron Hollow's eastern boundary or water rights be enjoined pending investigation of the amended survey document. They would simultaneously petition for a formal document examination. They would compile a sworn statement from Gideon attesting to the original condition of the house survey document and the dates of Vane's access to the premises. And they would wait for word from Pete and Bobby. The Mercer testimony is the thing that makes this unambiguous, Shaw said. Without it, we have a credibility contest between your father's original document and a county record that now contradicts it. The county record carries weight simply by virtue of being a county record. Mercer eliminates that problem. And if he's not alive, Gideon said, then we fight harder on the document examination, Shaw said. It's winnable. It's just slower and more expensive and less certain. He closed his case. I'll have the petition drafted by tomorrow morning. Is there anything else I should know? Gideon looked at Mara. She thought for a moment. Mrs. Adelaide Cross, she said, in Larcher Wells. She's been spreading specific false statements about my character. We believe she was placed in the community by Vane in advance as a tool for this exact purpose. Shaw looked at her steadily. Do you have evidence of her connection to Vane? Not documentary evidence, she said. But she arrived in Larcher Wells 4 months ago with enough money to establish a business, and she has existing social connections with at least 2 of the prominent individuals who signed a letter calling for my dismissal. The timing of her arrival aligns with the period when Vane would have been planning this strategy. Circumstantial, Shaw said. At present, she said. But if her testimony becomes relevant to any legal proceeding, if Vane attempts to use her statements about my character to undermine my credibility as a witness, I'd want that connection examined. Shaw looked at her for a long moment. You think ahead, he said. Someone has to, she said. He almost smiled. I'll look into Mrs. Cross's background. He stood, picked up his case, nodded to Gideon. I'll be back tomorrow with the draft petition. In the meantime, don't approach Vane, don't discuss this with anyone in town, and lock that document up somewhere better than a study desk. Already done, Gideon said. Shaw left. The room was quiet for a moment. Gideon was looking at the table. He had the expression of a man managing something large by keeping it compartmentalized, which she recognized as a reasonable strategy, but one that had a limited lifespan. How are you? She said. He looked up. The question had caught him off guard. She could tell because his face did something unguarded for just a second before it settled. Angry, he said. Mostly angry. That makes sense. And he stopped, looked at his hands on the table. My father spent 30 years building this. He died in that bedroom down the hall. And some man who never broke a sweat over anything except counting other people's money thinks he can... He stopped again. She waited. I should have seen this coming, he said. You couldn't have seen this specifically, she said. I saw enough. I saw a man who didn't take no for an answer, and I kept treating it like a business negotiation. His voice was controlled, but with something underneath it that was less controlled. You saw it clearly from the first week. I had reasons to recognize it that you didn't, she said. That's not an excuse, he said, not unkindly, more like a man who had certain standards for himself and applied them consistently. She looked at him. No, she said, it's not an excuse. But it is a reason, and reasons matter when you're trying to learn rather than just blame yourself. He was quiet. You're fighting it now, she said. That's what matters. He nodded once, and then he stood up and went to do whatever needed doing, because that was what he did. He moved when he needed to move, and she respected that about him more than she'd let herself fully acknowledge. 4 days passed. They were the particular kind of difficult that came not from crisis, but from waiting on crisis, which was in some ways harder because it left too much room for the mind to fill in the gaps with worst-case scenarios. The petition was filed. Shaw confirmed it had been received by the district court. Vane had not yet made a formal filing, which Shaw said could mean several things, and probably meant he was waiting to see what Iron Hollow's legal response looked like before committing to a particular approach. The ranch ran. Meals were cooked, cattle were tended, fences were checked. Mara kept to her routines with deliberate steadiness because she understood that the atmosphere of a household followed the people running it, and if she became visibly anxious, the hands would feel it, and work would suffer, and people would start talking, and she had enough people talking already. Dorsey had changed in ways that were subtle but real. He wasn't warm. She doubted warmth was in his natural range, but the bureaucratic obstruction had stopped. He passed supply information along properly. Schedule changes reached her in time to be useful. He didn't offer opinions on her methods in the hearing of others anymore. It wasn't friendship, and she didn't mistake it for friendship, but it was something workable, and workable was what she needed. On the 5th day, she was doing accounts at the kitchen table when Bobby Crane came back. Without Pete. She was on her feet before Bobby had fully come through the door. "Where's Pete?" she said. "Coming," Bobby said. He was dusty and tired in a bone-deep way, the kind of tired that was more than just the ride. "He's behind me by a few hours. He's bringing someone." She looked at him. "We found Jonas Mercer," Bobby said. She sat back down because her legs felt briefly unreliable. "Tell me," she said. They'd ridden to Carbon County in a day and a half, pushing the horses as much as they dared. In the county seat, they'd asked at the land office for any record of a Jonas Mercer, surveyor, active in the early 1870s. The clerk had looked at them with the mild curiosity of a man who handled unusual requests regularly enough not to find them notable, and had checked a ledger and found a retired surveyor of that name who had an address listed on the county rolls as a farmstead 6 miles east of town. They'd ridden out. The farmstead was small, nothing like Iron Hollow. A modest house, a kitchen garden, a few chickens, the kind of place a man settled into when the working part of his life was mostly behind him. Jonas Mercer himself had answered the door. He was 81 years old. He walked with a cane, and his hearing was not what it had been. Bobby described repeating himself several times at increasing volume before the old man had fully understood what he was saying. But his mind, once it engaged, was sharp in a way that surprised them both. He remembered the Iron Hollow survey, Bobby said. The minute Pete mentioned the name Thorne in the year 1871, he remembered. Said old Aldous Thorne, Mr. Thorne's father, was one of the most precise clients he'd ever worked for. Knew exactly what he wanted documented and why. Did he remember the boundary specifically? Mara asked. He remembered the creek, Bobby said. Said the creek was the whole point of the eastern boundary placement. Said Mr. Thorne's father was very particular about it. The boundary had to include the creek because that was the water that made the land worth having. He said, Bobby stopped and pulled a piece of paper from his vest pocket, unfolded it carefully. I wrote down what he said exactly because I thought you'd want it. He handed her the paper. She read the old man's words as Bobby had transcribed them. The eastern boundary line runs to the creek bed and includes it. That was Aldous Thorne's specification, and I surveyed it to his specification and filed my report accordingly. The creek belongs to Iron Hollow. I would swear to that on any document this side of the Mississippi. She set the paper down. Is he willing to come, she said, to testify in person? Pete's bringing him, Bobby said. That's why he's behind me. He needed a day to make arrangements for the farm. His neighbor's going to look after it. Bobby paused. He said he wanted to come. When we explained what had happened, the amended document, the county record, he got angry. I mean genuinely angry. The way old men get angry when they've lived long enough to know what something means. He said no man should be able to put his name on a lie and call it a survey. She looked at Bobby, at the dust on his face and the exhaustion in his eyes and the straightness of his spine regardless. You did well, she said. He ducked his head the way he did when he didn't know how to accept a direct compliment. You packed good bread, he said. That helped? She almost laughed. It wasn't quite a laugh. It came out more as a sharp exhale, but it was the closest thing to one she'd managed in 5 days. Go sleep, she said. I'll tell Mr. Thorne. Look. Gideon's response to the news was to stand very still for a moment and then say quietly, Good. That was it. But she'd known him long enough now to understand what that single word was carrying, and it was carrying quite a lot. She sent word to Shaw the same afternoon. Shaw's response came back the following morning. Mercer's testimony, if delivered in person and sworn, would be decisive. He was filing an additional declaration with the court. He wanted to see Mercer immediately upon his arrival. Pete arrived with Jonas Mercer the following afternoon. He was a tall man, even with age taking some of the height, white-haired and deliberate in his movements, with hands that had the specific look of a man who'd spent a lifetime doing precise work with instruments. He came through the gate of Iron Hollow and looked around with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between assessment and memory. Gideon met him in the yard. They shook hands. "Your father's place," Mercer said. He looked at the main house, the outbuildings, the paddock. "Looks well kept." "We try," Gideon said. "He was a good man, Aldous, careful about everything." Mercer's eyes were still moving around the property. "He showed me where he wanted that eastern line to run. Walked the whole boundary with me himself, every foot of it. Said that creek was the heart of the place." He looked at Gideon directly. "I understand someone's trying to cut it out." "Someone is," Gideon said. "Then let's put a stop to it," Mercer said. The meeting with Shaw took place in Gideon's front room that evening, with Mercer settled in the best chair with coffee and a plate of food that Mara had put together specifically because the man had ridden a long way and she was not going to let him sit in a legal meeting hungry. Shaw walked Mercer through the details of the original survey, the date, the methodology, the boundary specifications, and Mercer answered with the precision of someone who had spent 60 years developing that precision and didn't lose it just because the calendar had moved on. He identified the coordinates. He described the instruments he'd used. He described Aldous Thorne's specific instructions regarding the creek boundary. He described the filing he'd made with the county. Then Shaw showed him the amended document. Mercer looked at it for a long time. His face went very still. "This is not what I filed," he said. His voice was old and not particularly loud, but there was something in the flatness of it that made the room feel like it had contracted. "You're certain?" Shaw said. "I surveyed that boundary. I wrote up that document and I filed it with the Harlow County Land Office in October of 1871. This amendment," he tapped the notation with one finger, "this was not on the document I filed. This notation changes the boundary I surveyed. Whoever added this is describing a line that does not match the survey I performed and submitted." "Would you be willing to state that under oath in a formal legal proceeding?" Shaw asked. "I'll state it under oath, in a court, in a newspaper, or in the street," Mercer said. "I'm 81 years old, and I have exactly as much patience for lying as I've always had, which is none at all." Shaw looked at Gideon. Gideon was looking at Mercer with an expression that was more exposed than he usually permitted. Gratitude and something that was older than gratitude. Something that had to do with his father's name and his father's land and what it meant to have someone willing to stand up and say what was true. "Thank you," Gideon said. Mercer waved his hand dismissively. "Don't thank me for telling the truth. That's the baseline." Vane made his move 2 days later. Shaw had anticipated it, but the specific form it took surprised even him. Vane did not file a formal legal claim. Instead, he called a meeting. That was the word that reached Iron Hollow, carried by the same channels, that all information traveled in a territory where people lived close enough together that news moved faster than horses. A meeting of prominent landowners and business interests in Larcher Wells at the Fieldstone Hotel on Thursday evening to discuss what Vane described as concerns about property record integrity in Harlow County, which was a very careful way of framing what amounted to a public attempt to establish his version of events before the legal proceedings could establish the correct version. Mara heard about it from Dorsey, who had heard it from the farrier in town, and she went to Gideon immediately. "He's trying to set the narrative," she said. "Before Mercer's testimony becomes part of the record, before the document examination, he wants the community to hear his side from himself, in his own words, in a room full of people who already have some reason to believe him." "And if I don't show up, I look like I'm hiding something," Gideon said. "And if you do show up, you're on his ground, in his meeting, on his terms," she said. "There's no version of this where showing up is comfortable," Gideon said. "No," she agreed, "but not showing up is worse." He looked at her. "Come with me." She'd expected to be left behind. She hadn't fully realized until this moment that she'd been bracing for that. "You're the one who's understood this from the beginning," he said. "I'm not walking into that room without you." The Fieldstone Hotel's main meeting room held about 60 people on a full night, and on Thursday it was full. Mara had been in rooms where she was the subject of discussion before, but not quite like this. Not where the discussion was ongoing when she walked in, and the conversation shifted when she and Gideon came through the door, and she could see in the slight changes in posture and expression the specific discomfort of people who had been speaking about someone who had just appeared. Vane was at the front of the room. He looked at them when they came in. He smiled. It was the pleasant smile, the one she'd seen from the kitchen window, the one that said he had already won. She didn't react to it. She found 2 chairs along the side wall and she and Gideon sat down. And she kept her back straight and her face neutral and looked at the front of the room. The meeting began. Vane spoke well. She had to give him that. He had the kind of practiced public manner that came from spending years in rooms like this one. The ability to sound reasonable while saying things that were not quite true. To frame a situation in a way that seemed balanced while tilting everything toward one conclusion. He talked about the county land office break-in as a community concern. He didn't name suspects, but the implication hung in the air. He talked about property record integrity as a regional issue affecting everyone. He talked about the need for clear, undisputed boundaries so that good neighbors could remain good neighbors. He said nothing directly false that could be immediately corrected. That was the craft of it. After about 20 minutes, he paused and looked out at the room. "I believe Mr. Thorne is here tonight," he said, pleasantly. "I'm glad of it. These are exactly the kinds of concerns that should be discussed openly." The room looked at Gideon. Gideon stood. He was not a man who gave speeches. Mara had never seen him address a room before, and she watched with something that was not quite anxiety and not quite calm, something in between, waiting. "I'm here," Gideon said. "I'll say this clearly. The boundary survey of Iron Hollow was performed by Jonas Mercer in 1871 and includes the eastern creek in the property. The original survey document confirms that. The man who performed the survey is alive and is currently a guest at my ranch, and he has provided a sworn statement confirming the original boundary and stating clearly that the amendment which now appears in county records was not part of the document he filed." He paused. "I'm also prepared to allow an independent examination of both the House document and the county record by a qualified expert because I'm confident in what that examination will show." A murmur moved through the room. Vane's smile had shifted. Not disappeared, he was too controlled for that. But something behind it had changed. "Additionally," Gideon said, and his voice was the same level it had been throughout, "I've asked my attorney to look into the background of Mrs. Adelaide Cross, whose recent statements about a member of my household I have reason to believe are false. If there's anyone in this room who gave those statements weight, I'd ask them to withhold judgment until that investigation is complete." He sat down. The room was very quiet. Mara could feel the quality of the quiet, the way it had a different texture from the quiet before Gideon stood up. This was the quiet of a room that had been tilted one direction and had just felt itself tilt back. Vane recovered quickly. He spoke again, smoothly, redirected the conversation, suggested that, of course, all of this was a matter for the courts, and everyone should let the legal process proceed. He was gracious about it in a way that might have fooled some people, but the room had felt the tilt. And Mara, watching from the side wall, watching people's faces rather than Vane's, could see that at least some of them, the ones who hadn't been in his pocket, who'd just been going along, were looking at the situation differently now. They were almost at the door when Margaret Fielding appeared. She was a handsome woman of about 60, well-dressed in the particular way of someone who took presentation seriously as a form of social authority. She was the one who'd written the additional paragraph at the bottom of the letter, the one about moral character. She stopped in front of Mara. Mara stopped. They looked at each other. Fielding had the expression of someone who'd prepared something to say and was now finding that the preparation didn't quite account for standing face to face with the actual person. "Miss Ellsworth," she said. "Mrs. Fielding," Mara said. A pause. "The letter," Fielding said. "That I signed." She stopped, started again. "I was given information that I now have reason to question." Mara waited. "I acted on that information without—" Fielding paused with genuine difficulty. "Without verifying it. That was wrong." She said it like it cost her something. Mara looked at her. "People told you a story," Mara said, "and you believed it because the person telling it seemed credible and you had no specific reason to doubt them. That's not stupidity. That's just what happens when someone works hard enough to seem credible." Fielding looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in the older woman's expression. "I'll speak with the others who signed," she said. Mara nodded. They parted. Gideon, walking beside her toward the door, said quietly, "You went easier on her than she deserved." "Maybe," Mara said, "but she came to say it. That took something." They stepped out into the night. Across the street, a light was on in the window of the boarding house on Prospect Street where Adelaide Cross had her establishment. Mara looked at it for a moment and thought about the machinery of it, the patience, the installation of pieces, the months of preparation for a campaign that was now beginning to come apart at the edges. She thought about Vane's face when Gideon had said Jonas Mercer's name. The pleasantness had not left his face. But something behind the pleasantness had, something that, once she'd seen it go, told her it had always been the most important thing in the room. "It's not over," Gideon said. It wasn't asking. "No," she said. "He still has moves." "What's the next one?" She thought about it as they walked to where the horses were tied. "He'll come to you," she said, "privately, not in a room full of people. He'll offer you something, a settlement, a compromise, something that looks like a way to end this without more conflict. And the terms will be arranged so that ending it costs you something real." Gideon untied his horse. "And what do I say?" "You say you need to think about it," she said. "And then you tell me immediately, because whatever he offers, we need to see it clearly before you respond." He held the reins and looked at her over the back of the horse. "You anticipated the letter," he said. "You anticipated him coming to the meeting. You anticipated him approaching me privately." "He's not complicated," she said. "He's just patient, and he's done this before. Once you understand what he wants and what he's willing to do to get it, the moves follow." "And what does he want?" "At the core of it," she thought. "He wants the water," she said. "But that's the specific thing. Underneath it, he wants what men like him always want. He wants to be the one who decides who gets to keep what they've built and who doesn't." She put her foot in the stirrup. "That's the part I'm not willing to give him." She mounted. Gideon mounted. They rode back toward Iron Hollow in the dark, and the road was long and quiet, and somewhere behind them Silas Vane was still in that meeting room, still smiling, still calculating. But Jonas Mercer was asleep in a guest room at Iron Hollow, and the original survey was locked away. And somewhere in Shaw's office was a sworn statement that said plainly and under oath that the line on the ground and the lie on the paper were two different things, and that the man who knew the difference was still alive and willing to say so. Vane came 3 days later, exactly as she'd said he would. He arrived alone, which surprised her. No riders, no lawyer, just the man himself on a good horse in the middle of the afternoon. She saw him from the kitchen window and felt something settle in her chest. Not fear, something more like recognition. She told Gideon he was coming before Vane had even reached the gate. Gideon went out to meet him. She did not follow, not yet. She positioned herself near the side window of the front room, where she could hear voices from the yard without being visible. This was deliberate. She wanted to hear Vane without him knowing she was listening, because a man spoke differently when he thought the person he was trying to neutralize was not in the room. She heard Gideon's greeting, brief and civil. She heard Vane's voice, easy and warm, the voice of a man arriving for a neighborly conversation. She heard them come inside. The front room was directly adjacent to where she stood. She could hear clearly. "I'll be honest with you, Gideon," Vane said, and the use of the first name, uninvited, familiar, told her something about how he'd decided to play this. "This has gotten more complicated than I intended. I came here today to see if we can find a simpler path." Gideon said nothing. She knew that silence. She knew he was waiting. "The boundary question is going to be expensive for both of us," Vane said. "Legal fees, court time, expert witnesses. It goes on and on. I've been thinking there might be a more practical solution. A negotiated agreement about water access. Something that gives me what I actually need and lets you keep the land as it is on paper." "And what do you actually need?" Gideon said. "Guaranteed access to the creek for my southern herd during dry months. That's the core of it. A formal easement, legally recorded, that ensures my cattle can reach that water." A pause. "And in exchange, I withdraw all existing claims. I end the boundary dispute, and I see to it that certain misunderstandings about people in your household are put right." She heard the shape of it clearly. What he was offering was not a compromise. He was offering to stop fighting on one front in exchange for winning on the essential one. An easement meant legal right of access, which meant he could expand that access incrementally over time, which meant eventually the creek was effectively shared under terms he controlled, which meant the protection of Iron Hollow's water that she'd identified in the very first week was dissolved, just more slowly and more legally. And the reference to misunderstandings about people in your household told her he knew exactly what he was doing. He was offering to call Mrs. Cross off. He was offering Mara's reputation in exchange for the easement. He was making it personal because he thought personal might work where legal pressure hadn't. She heard Gideon say, "I'll need to think about it." Vane said he understood. Said he hoped Gideon would see the wisdom of simplicity. Said he'd wait to hear. She heard the sound of the front door, footsteps on the porch, hoofbeats moving away. She stayed where she was for a moment. Then she stepped through the doorway into the front room. Gideon was standing in the middle of the room looking at the door. He turned when she came in. "You heard," he said. "I heard," she said. He looked at her directly. "He offered to clear your name." "I know. If I give him the easement." "I know that too." He was watching her face very carefully. "And what do you think?" She looked back at him. "I think he just handed us something," she said. He waited. "He made you an offer in private that directly involves me," she said. "The person he's been trying to discredit. He tied the legal dispute to a personal threat against me, explicitly, in one conversation." She let that sit for a second. "That's not just leverage. That's evidence of what Mrs. Cross's role has been all along. It establishes that the rumors weren't organic. They were his instrument. And he just admitted that to you, in your own house." Gideon was very still. "Who else is in this house right now?" she said. He thought. "Dorsey was fixing the shutter on the east window of the hall," he said slowly. The east window of the hall, which ran directly alongside the front room wall. She watched Gideon understand. "Dorsey," he said. She nodded. He walked to the hall door and opened it. Dorsey was standing at the window with a screwdriver he had not been using, and his expression was that of a man who had been standing very still for some time and knew it was obvious. "How much did you hear?" Gideon said. Dorsey looked at him, then at Mara, then back at Gideon. "All of it," he said. The three of them stood there. "Will you say so?" Mara asked. "To Shaw. In writing, what you heard him say." Dorsey was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet she recognized now as a man making a real decision rather than performing consideration. "Yes," he said. "I'll say so." Caleb Dorsey was not a man who said things he didn't mean. That was both his most useful quality and, for most of his life, his most limiting one. He said what he meant, and he meant what he said, and he didn't adjust either of those things based on what was convenient, which made him reliable and also made him difficult in the ways that straightforward people were difficult when the world wanted something more flexible from them. So when he said he would put what he'd heard into writing, Mara believed him. Shaw came the following morning and sat with Dorsey for 2 hours at the kitchen table while Mara made herself scarce in the storage room doing inventory she'd already done, close enough to be available if needed, far enough away to not be in the middle of it. She heard the low sound of their voices, the occasional pause, the scratch of Shaw's pen. When they were finished, Dorsey came through to the storage room doorway with the expression of a man who'd done something mildly uncomfortable and was not looking for acknowledgement of that fact. "It's done," he said. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back to work. Shaw found her a few minutes later. He had his case under his arm and his hat in his hand, and the particular energized stillness of someone who'd just received something valuable and was already thinking about how to use it. "This is the piece that changes the shape of it," he said. "Everything else we have is documentary. The original survey, Mercer's testimony, the ink analysis I've commissioned. Strong, but interpretable. What Dorsey witnessed is Vane explicitly connecting his manipulation of your reputation to the legal dispute. In his own words, to the property owner, as a negotiating term." He paused. "That's not a land dispute anymore. That's extortion dressed up in property law." "Will it hold up?" she said. "Dorsey is a credible witness with no financial interest in the outcome and no prior relationship with you that a defense attorney could use to suggest bias," Shaw said. "And his account of what was said is specific, dated, and consistent with everything else we've established about Vane's methods." He looked at her. "It'll hold." He left. Mara stood in the storage room for a moment. The shelves were in good order around her, everything where it should be, properly labeled, properly rotated, the kind of order that looked simple from the outside. and was the result of 100 small decisions compounding over months. She thought that was probably true of most things worth having. The document examiner arrived from Cheyenne 4 days later, a precise, unhurried man named Harold Bates, who carried his instruments in a leather case that looked older than he was, and who examined both the house survey and, through Shaw's petition to the court, the county record, and who produced a written analysis 14 pages long that concluded, without qualifications, that the amendment appearing in both documents had been added after the original documents were produced, using different ink and a different instrument, and that the handwriting of the amendment notation did not match any other handwriting appearing on either document. He delivered his conclusions in front of the district court judge, a man named Horace Delmont, who had the particular brand of patience that long service in territorial courts produced. The patience of someone who had seen enough human dishonesty to be unsurprised by any specific instance of it, but who remained, despite that, committed to the process of establishing what was actually true. Jonas Mercer testified the following day. Mara was not in the courtroom. She had no standing to be there in a formal legal capacity, but Bobby Crane was. And he came back to Iron Hollow that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table and told her everything while she fed him because he'd missed lunch. The old man walked in there like he owned the building, Bobby said. Sat down, looked at the judge, and when Vane's lawyer tried to suggest his memory wasn't reliable because of his age, he looked at the lawyer very calmly and said, "Son, I've been reading survey instruments since before your father was born, and I remember every boundary I've ever surveyed the same way you remember how to walk. You don't forget the things that are in your hands." Bobby shook his head slightly. The courtroom went quiet in a specific way. What did Vane's witness say?" she asked. "He had one, a man named Craddock, who claimed to have seen the original survey document 10 years ago and that the amendment was present at that time." Bobby paused. Shaw took about 20 minutes with him. By the end of it, Craddock couldn't clearly state what year he'd claimed to see the document, couldn't describe the office where he'd supposedly seen it, and when Shaw showed him a map and asked him to point to the location of the boundary as he remembered it, he pointed to the wrong county entirely. Mara looked at her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "And Dorsey's statement?" she said. "Read into the record," Bobby said. Vane's lawyer objected to it. Judge Delmont overruled him, said the content of a private negotiation offered as evidence of the negotiating party's intent was admissible in his court, and he'd hear arguments against that position from someone with better grounds than this one. She was quiet. "How is Mr. Thorne?" she said. Bobby considered this. He stopped. "I don't know how to say this right. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something for a long time and could feel the weight of it starting to come off. Not all the way off, but starting." She nodded. She understood that feeling. She'd been carrying her own version of it for 3 years. The judge's ruling came on a Thursday afternoon. Shaw brought it in person rather than sending word, which told her before he said anything that the news was good. He came through the gate with the kind of posture a man has when he's delivering something he's glad to deliver. And Gideon came out of the main house to meet him, and Mara watched from the kitchen doorway. She didn't go out immediately. She waited. Watched Gideon read this document Shaw handed him. Watched him read it twice, which was not his usual habit. Gideon was a man who read things once and understood them. The second reading told her it was taking a moment to be real. Then he looked up and saw her in the doorway. He held up the document. She went out. The ruling was 6 pages. Shaw walked them through it standing in the yard because nobody thought to go inside. The fraudulent boundary amendment was overturned. The original 1871 survey boundary, placing the creek within Iron Hollow's property, was confirmed as the legally operative boundary. The county was ordered to correct its records. And based on the evidence of Vane's explicit offer to Gideon, tying the resolution of the legal dispute to the cessation of his campaign against Mara's reputation, the judge had referred the matter to the Territorial Attorney General for further investigation into potential fraud and extortion. "What does that mean for Vane?" Gideon asked. "It means it's not over for him," Shaw said. "The AG's office will look at everything. The Mrs. Cross arrangement, the break-in at the county land office, the falsified documents, the offer made to you. If they find what I expect they'll find—" He paused. "This won't be the only property he's done this to. Men who operate this way operate systematically. There will be others." I was right. The others came forward over the following weeks. In ones and twos at first, and then more steadily as word moved through the territory that what had happened to Iron Hollow had happened to them too. Smaller ranchers, families with less money and less documentation, and no Mara Ellsworth to spot the pattern, who had lost parcels or water access, or been pressured into sales they hadn't wanted and hadn't understood until later what they'd actually given up. Mara heard about them through Shaw, who kept Gideon informed as the AG's investigation widened. Each account that came in carried its own specific weight. A family 3 counties over who'd sold their eastern field at below value, not understanding until the dry summer that followed that they'd sold their only reliable water source. A widow in Carbon County who'd signed an easement that had been worded so as to make her property practically unsellable. A rancher south of Larcher Wells who'd lost 40 acres in a boundary dispute with a county record that he couldn't afford to contest. She didn't know all of their names, but she thought about them. She thought about the morning Silas Vane had walked out of her family's farmhouse with that folded foreclosure notice and that smile. And she thought about how many mornings like that there had been, in different houses, with different families, all of them standing in the wake of a man who'd learned to use paperwork and patience as weapons and had never once had to account for it. Until now. Vane's assets were frozen pending the investigation before the first frost. His ranch went into legal receivership by the following spring. The family whose land had been the original target of his southern water scheme, the one Shaw had found in Carbon County, were eventually offered first right of purchase on the property at assessed value when it was finally sold, which wasn't a perfect ending, but was something. Real things rarely ended perfectly. They ended with whatever you'd managed to hold on to and whatever you'd managed to take back, and the understanding that those were 2 different categories and both mattered. Adelaide Cross left Larcher Wells quietly sometime in November. Nobody made much of it publicly. The boarding house on Prospect Street eventually took a new tenant, and within a season or two, the name Adelaide Cross faded from the conversation the way names did when the story attached to them resolved. Margaret Fielding came to Iron Hollow on a Wednesday in late October. She arrived alone, which Mara noted, and she came to the kitchen door rather than the front of the house, which Mara also noted. She knocked with the deliberate knock of someone who'd been practicing what they were going to say. Mara opened the door. "Mrs. Fielding," she said. "Miss Ellsworth," Fielding said. "May I come in?" She let her in, made coffee, because it was what you did, set it on the table and sat down across from the older woman and waited. Fielding wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment. "I organized the letter," she said. "I want to say that plainly because I think it deserves to be said plainly. I was the one who gathered the signatures. I wrote the paragraph at the bottom about—" She stopped. "About your character, which I had no actual basis for." "No," Mara agreed. Fielding looked up. "I want to tell you that I was deceived," she said. "And that's true. I was given false information by a person I had no specific reason to distrust at the time." She paused. "But I've been thinking, since all of this, since it became clear what Mrs. Cross was and what Vane was doing, I've been thinking about the fact that I believed it so readily." She said the last part like it was something she hadn't wanted to look at and had looked at anyway. "I believed it readily because you were an outsider, because you arrived with nothing and inserted yourself into a prominent household and started having influence over decisions. I believed it because it fit a story I already had ready." She looked at Mara directly. "That's not Mrs. Cross's fault. That part is mine." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't say that," she said. "Most people should," Fielding said. They sat with that. "I can't undo the letter," Fielding said. "I know that. I can tell you that I've spoken personally to everyone who signed it, and I've spoken publicly to anyone who'll listen about what I know now and what I should have verified before I acted. Whether that's worth anything to you—" She stopped. "I don't know if it is, but I wanted you to hear it directly." Mara looked at the woman across from her, the careful posture, the unwillingness to look away, the specific discomfort of someone doing the harder thing because it was the harder thing, and not because it was comfortable or because they expected to be forgiven. "It's worth something," Mara said. "Not everything, but something," and she meant it. Fielding nodded. She drank her coffee. After a while she asked about the ranch, how it was running, how the hands were settling after the disruption, and Mara answered, and they talked for 20 minutes about practical things and the way that practical women talked. And by the time Fielding left, something had shifted between them that was not yet friendship, but was no longer damage. The wedding was in late November, when the worst of the heat was long past, and the mornings had gone gold and cold, and the light sat low and clear across the eastern pasture. Mara had not expected to feel nervous. She was 27 years old, 28 in the spring, and she'd spent the past several months managing legal crises and household accounts, and 43 men's dietary needs and a fraudulent land scheme. And she was not generally a woman who found situations difficult to face. But standing in the small room off the main hall while Bobby Crane's older sister, who'd come up from Rawlins for the occasion, helped her with the buttons on the back of her dress, she found that her hands were not entirely steady. "You all right?" Bobby's sister, her name was Clara, asked. "Fine," Mara said. "You look like someone who's trying to convince themselves of something," Clara said, without particular judgment. "I'm marrying a man I've known for 5 months," Mara said. "Do you know him?" Mara thought about it. She thought about the 2 o'clock in the morning in the kitchen when he'd appeared with a lamp and asked if she slept. She thought about him riding out to the eastern pasture by himself to look at the creek after she'd told him what it meant. She thought about the way he'd looked at Jonas Mercer when Mercer said the creek belonged here, and about the single word good when Bobby told him Mercer was coming, and about the way he'd said her name in the hall, and she'd known from the quality of the saying that something between them had already changed and wasn't going back. "Yes," she said, "I know him." "Then you're fine," Clara said, and did up the last button. "Yeah." The ceremony was small. Everett Shaw was there. Jonas Mercer had stayed because Gideon had asked him to, and he sat in the best chair looking pleased with himself in the way of old men who believe they have contributed to a good outcome and are right. Bobby was there, and Pete, and Earl, and the rest of the hands who'd been at Iron Hollow through all of it. Dorsey stood at the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending something he hadn't expected to find meaningful, and did. Margaret Fielding was there because Mara had asked her, because she'd decided that the harder version of things was usually the more honest version, and the harder version here was choosing to include rather than exclude the people who'd been wrong and had tried to be right about it afterward. It was not a seamless day. The justice of the peace was late. One of the horses got loose during the ceremony and had to be retrieved by Earl, which caused a brief pause and a sound from the assembled group that was clearly suppressed laughter. Mara's veil, which had been her mother's and which she'd pressed carefully the night before, developed a wrinkle during the ride to where they were gathered that she noticed and couldn't fix, and eventually decided to stop thinking about. She stood beside Gideon and said what she meant and meant what she said, and he did the same. And it was real in the way that only undecorated things are entirely real. Afterward, she stood in the yard of Iron Hollow, her home, she said it to herself and let it land, and looked at the people around her. Bobby eating 2 plates of food with the commitment of someone making up for years of missed dinners. Mercer telling Dorsey something at length. Dorsey listening with more patience than he typically exhibited. Shaw talking to Fielding in the corner of the yard in a way that seemed less like professional courtesy and more like genuine conversation. Pete and Earl and the others moving among it all with the ease of people who had worked together long enough to be something like a community. Gideon appeared beside her. "Well," he said. "Well?" she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the same gathering. "I told Jonas last night that everything changed when you walked through that gate," he said. She looked at him. "He said you must have been a remarkable woman," Gideon said. "I told him remarkable didn't quite cover it." She didn't say anything for a second. "I wasn't remarkable," she said. "I was desperate, and I was experienced, and I was angry enough to not lie down about it." "That's a better story than remarkable," he said. She almost smiled. "Don't make it sentimental." "I'm not," he said. "I mean it." She looked at him. This man she'd made a life with in the space of 5 months in a crisis. This careful, internal man who said less than most and meant more than most, and had shaken her hand on a 5-day trial like it was the only contract that mattered, and had proved to be a man whose word could be relied on, which in her experience was rarer than it should have been. "I know you mean it," she said. He put his hand briefly over hers. She let it stay. The letter came in early spring. Shaw brought it himself, which was becoming a habit of his. He seemed to prefer delivering significant news in person, which she'd decided was one of his better qualities. He came on a Tuesday morning when the frost was still on the ground and handed it to Gideon, who read it and handed it to Mara without a word. It was from the Territorial Attorney General's office. The investigation into Silas Vane's property fraud had expanded to include a review of foreclosure proceedings in 3 counties from the period 1879 to 1883. Several of those foreclosures had been found to contain significant irregularities, evidence of manipulated debt records, coerced signatures, falsified documentation. One of those foreclosures was the seizure of 42 acres north of Rawlins belonging to an Eli Ellsworth, deceased, whose estate had been managed by his daughter, Mara Ellsworth, in the year preceding the foreclosure. The property itself could not be returned. It had changed hands twice since the original seizure, and the current owners had purchased it in good faith and had legal standing that superseded any restitution claim. The letter was careful about this, but the record, it said, was being corrected. The original foreclosure was being officially reclassified as improper, based on documentation indicating that the debt had been artificially inflated through falsified interest calculations, arranged through a third party with connections to the same network Vane had been using to accumulate land. Restitution from Vane's liquidated assets was being calculated for all affected parties, and would be distributed when the court proceedings concluded, likely within the year. Mara read the letter twice, the second time more slowly, then she folded it. She stood in the kitchen of Iron Hollow, her kitchen, with its properly organized shelves and its rotation system and its second supper window for the hands who came in late, and she was quiet for a long time. Gideon was watching her. "The money," she said finally. It's something. It'll go to Thomas mostly, and what's left of Ruth's situation. They need it more than we do." "What about you?" he said. She looked at the letter in her hands. "My father worked that land for 19 years, she said. He broke it and planted it and kept it through every bad year there was. And when Vane's people came and took it, the official record said my father failed, that it was his fault, that he wasn't good enough to hold what he'd built." She stopped. "Thomas believed that for a while. I think Ruth still does, a little. I think they absorbed it, the story that was told. Because when the paper says something, people believe the paper." "And now the paper says something different," Gideon said. "Now the paper says something true," she said. She set the letter on the table. There were things she'd expected to feel in a moment like this. She'd imagined it, in the way that people imagine the resolution of long wrongs, the kind of vindication that the mind runs toward when things are at their worst as a way of surviving. She'd imagined it would feel like something sudden and large, like a door thrown open. It felt quieter than that. It felt like something that had been crooked for 3 years slowly settling back to level. It didn't make the 3 years go away. It didn't give back what she'd spent those years without. But it was real, and it was permanent, and it was in the record now, and the record mattered because records were what other people read when they tried to understand what had happened, and she had learned better than most what it meant when the record lied. "I want to write to Thomas," she said. "Of course," Gideon said, "and I want to write to the AG's office, to ask if any of the other families affected by Vane's network, if there are any of them who don't have someone helping them navigate the restitution process. Because that paperwork is not simple, and some of those families won't have—" She stopped. "They won't have what we have. Access to an attorney, someone who knows how to read a legal letter." Gideon looked at her. "That's going to take time," he said. "I have time," she said. He nodded once, and she could see that he understood, not just what she was saying, but why she was saying it, what it came from, what it cost her to hold it, and what it would cost her not to do something with it. The coin outside the gate was never recovered. She'd thought about it occasionally in the months since she'd pressed it into the dirt, wondered if someone had found it, if the ground had simply taken it, if it sat there still under a thin layer of soil in Wyoming winter. She'd never gone to look. It felt important somehow not to go to look. She thought about it again one afternoon in late spring, standing at the kitchen window watching Bobby teach one of the newer hands, a 17-year-old from Casper named Will, who had arrived 3 weeks earlier with nothing but a bedroll and the willingness to work, how to properly maintain the storage room rotation she'd installed. Bobby was explaining it with the patience of someone who had been that 17-year-old not very long ago, and Will was listening with the focused attention of someone who was being treated like what he did mattered, which was often enough to make someone actually make it matter. Gideon appeared beside her at the window. He was quiet for a moment, watching the same thing she was watching. "He's good with the younger ones," Gideon said. "He had someone be good with him," she said. They watched Bobby walk Will through the labeling system, pointing at each shelf with the seriousness of someone conveying something genuinely important, because it was genuinely important, because everything that was done right in a place like this was a small decision that compounded into something larger, and the people who understood that were the ones worth keeping. "I used to think this place was a ranch," Gideon said. She looked at him. "That's what I'd call it," he said. "When people asked, a cattle ranch, Iron Hollow Ranch." He paused. "I don't think of it that way anymore." "What do you think of it as?" she said. He considered. "A place where people can build something," he said, "if they're willing to work and you give them a fair shot at it." She thought about the coin in the dirt. She thought about walking through that gate with a cast iron skillet and a recipe tin and a refusal to enter as a beggar. She thought about what she'd carried instead of money, the years of her hands knowing what to do, the memory of her mother's kitchen, the education that had come from watching loss up close and learning every detail of how it operated. She had never needed to be rescued. That wasn't what she'd been missing. What she'd been missing was a place that would let her be useful at the full extent of what she was capable of, and recognize it when it saw it, and not require her to be smaller or quieter or more agreeable in exchange for the basic dignity of having her work count. She'd walked into Iron Hollow and found that place, and then fought like hell to keep it, and the fighting had been real, and the cost had been real, and the outcome was not a story where everything was made right and nothing had been lost. Her family's farm was still in someone else's hands. 3 years of her life had been spent surviving when they might have been spent building. Silas Vane had hurt people who would carry that hurt longer than any legal proceeding could address. And none of that was going to be fixed by a court ruling, however correct it was, or a letter from an attorney general, or the sight of a dishonest man's assets being parceled out to people he'd wronged. What remained was what she'd chosen to do with what was left. She turned from the window and went back to her work. She had accounts to finish. The monthly reconciliation she did at the end of every quarter, checking every line against receipts, making sure the numbers were true, because she had learned that numbers that lied were only waiting to be used against you. She had a letter to finish to Thomas, who had written back from his railroad job with the kind of restrained relief of someone who'd been told a story about himself was wrong, but wasn't quite sure yet how to stop believing it. She had Will's supper portion to increase because he was too thin and had been thin long enough that his body needed time to catch up. She had things to do. That was what she had. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened the ledger, picked up her pen, and began. Outside, somewhere near the gate, a coin sat in the Wyoming earth doing nothing in particular. It didn't need to. Everything that needed doing was already being done by the woman who'd left it there.